Good morning. We're here today to tell you about Corbie Ellington Day, October the 12th, 2024. This is a great day in Kentucky. It's a beautiful sunny day, and we're glad to have you with us today. Beneath the still waters of Cave Run Lake, at the south end of Rowan County, lie the old river road and the farmland. Nearly forgotten was the community of Yale and Bangor, Kentucky. Beneath those waters lie the words long ago spoken by the inhabitants of those communities, now hidden from view by the waters of the lake. The evidence of hard labor, of victories, of failures, of love of persons and love of friends and family, and of times of hardness, but times of leisure as well. Hard work balanced with fishing on the banks of the Licking River, swimming in the Licking River, and spending time with friends, young and old. Signs of enduring love of both the land and of the people, both young and both old, both living and dead. It is in these communities of Yale and Bangor that our story unfolds. It was just past the middle of September 1891 at the 1,000-acre Ellington River Farm. A third of cutting of hay just wasn't going to be possible this year. The weather just wasn't going to work for them. But that was not a real problem because the Ellingtons had enough hay stacked up from the year before. They would be able to get through the winter just fine. And all the grain had been harvested except for that little patch of corn down by the river that had to be planted late because of the flooding. All the grain was in the barn, and now it was time to sit back and relax a little bit. And as George B. Ellington came in from the barn, knowing that all of this work had been done and the preparations had been done, he walked into the kitchen with the screen door slightly closing behind him. Kate was there, smiling, knowing that now, at last, he and her would have some time together, some time not encumbered by working 12-hour days from sunset to sunrise to sunset, and that they would be able to now spend some time together. And they did. And then on July the 9th of 1892, Kate Ellington was a full 9 months pregnant. She felt as if she would just about pop. The doctor had been by the farm the day before and let her know that he would be in the area for quite some time because there seemed to be some epidemic of childbirthing in the area in the southern parts of Rowan County. On July the 10th of 1982, George B. slipped out of the bed trying to let Kate rest. That was Kate. Her actual name was Catherine. She went by Kate. She'd had a rough night the night before, and he tended to the livestock quietly and slipped back into the house, barely letting the door close behind him, the screen door, making nearly no sound. He went into the bedroom and he saw that Kate was there. It was unusual to come into the house and not smell breakfast cooking, but of course he knew why that was and why Kate wasn't up cooking breakfast for him this morning. He slipped into the bedroom, and Kate was full on in labor. He comforted her the best that he could, and then he ran quickly out the door. This time, the door slammed behind him. His horse had already been saddled as he had been out working in the fields for a few hours or a few minutes as he was trying to complete things and make sure everything was in order. So his horse was still saddled. He ran out, jumped on his horse, and he went to get the doctor. About an hour later, he came back and ran into the house, the door slamming behind him. He runs into the bedroom, and Kate is still there. The baby's not come, and so he lets her know that the doctor's on his way. A few minutes later, the doctor came into the driveway and came into the yard with his buggy and tied off his horse and went in to check on Kate. He asked George to leave as he examined Kate, and George went outside trying to keep busy, to do something to keep himself busy, but he basically just wrung his hands and worried and paced back and forth, worrying about Kate. What seemed like an eternity went by, and then the doctor came out the screen door, and he said to George, "Aren't you going to come in here and look at this young boy?" So the doctor was almost knocked down as George B. ran through the door, ran into the bedroom, and saw his wife, Kate. And for the first time, saw this beautiful baby boy, Corbie Ellington. What a cute baby he was. Of course, even if he hadn't been, the father would have always thought he was. But Corbie was indeed a good-looking, fine-looking young lad. So Corbie grew up in the farming community of Yale, and Bangor and Yale were really close together. They're both underwater there, or most of the community was underwater there now because of Cave Run Lake that was completed in the 60s. But we don't know a lot about his childhood years, except for that the census records show that he could read and write at the age of 6 years of age. And that was probably due to Kate's guidance and her instruction at home. But he went to school in Bangor, and for all practical purposes, everything that we know, he seemed to have just an ordinary childhood, just a typical farm boy from the south end of Rowan County. He did have a few sweethearts, one of them being Hannah Smith as he got older. But then on June the 5th of 2017 came the countrywide draft. America was going into World War I. Now, World War I started in 1914, but it wasn't until 1917 that the United States would get into this war. And that was primarily because the supply ships that we were sending over to Great Britain and to our allies were being more and more sunk by our enemies. And so therefore, we joined the war effort. And when we joined the war effort, it was kind of like a precursor to what we did in World War II. Now, the entire country wasn't involved as much as they were in World War II, but we built one of the largest, in fact, the largest Army training post at that time in Kentucky. It was called Camp Taylor. It was built 6 miles southeast of Louisville, Kentucky. Now, people think of, well, Louisville, you got Fort Knox. Well, Fort Knox was built on the other side of the city. And so Camp Taylor was built on the southeastern side, about 6 miles outside the city center. Now, believe this or not, there were 1,500 buildings that were built in a mere 90 days. Today, we can't get one house constructed hardly in a year. They did 1,500 buildings, including barracks and buildings of all kinds, stables for horses, in a mere 90 days. There were over 10,000 construction people that were involved in this project, and it was just a humongous. Louisville was chosen because, number one, the Louisville Fathers wanted this territory, wanted this fort there, and second, because Louisville had all the infrastructure in line for this. So this fort was built, and Corbie Ellington would end up going there as a trainee. He was actually drafted, when he signed up for the draft, as all persons were required of his age, on June the 5th of 2017. And then on October the 3rd of 2017, he was actually inducted into the United States Army. And he was assigned to the 125th Company of the 32nd Battalion of the Provincial Training Regiment there at Camp Taylor. Now, while he was in training, he had to leave, and he went home, and he married Hannah Smith on November the 7th of 1917. So he was only about a month into training where he got a break, and he went home and married Hannah. On February the 16th of 1918, he was assigned then to Company K of the 6th Infantry, 1st Division of the American Expeditionary, try to say that twice, Expeditionary Forces, part of the 5th Infantry Division. Now, he would travel by train to the East Coast, and then would travel by ship to France. And when he got to France, he would basically march across the entire country of France before he got to the Argonne Forest. Now, as he went, sometimes he was in battle, sometimes he was not. But early on, as he's going through the part that was not infested with battle, he would pick up these postcards of the general community, sometimes of buildings, but sometimes of ornate churches, sometimes of farm fields and the cattle and the way they use cattle and horses. And so he was amazed at the way the French did their farming. And he wrote back to Hannah. And these postcards, he would put a lot of information on a small postcard. And when he would mail these postcards, they were simply addressed to Hannah, Yale, Kentucky. And they got to her, every one of them. Today we have problems even getting things with zip codes to the correct person sometimes. So it's really quite amazing that anyone in the General Mail Service would even know where Yale, Kentucky was, such a small village. So as he marched through the country, they would have battles from time to time, and he would be going involved in trenches, and they would be trenches just like this one. And they would come out of the trench on the ladders, and they would go forward. And he was a bugler as well as an infantryman, so he carried a rifle and a bugle. And so he said that sometimes they would come out and they would have to fight, and other times they would come out and the Germans basically would just surrender, some of them would. So, of course, when he's writing to his wife, he's not going to tell her about the gory portions of battle, as he would not want her to worry. But he was lucky, it seemed, because he was, he had just, when he left Camp Taylor, he had just missed the Spanish flu epidemic that killed so many thousands of people across our nation and here in Kentucky. And the Spanish flu was brought into Camp Taylor by some people purportedly from Bowling Green. The recruits that were coming in had brought the Spanish flu in, and it infected the entire camp. And there were as many as 25% of the entire camp was infected seriously at one point. And sometimes before they realized what was going on, these guys would take leave and they would go home into the mountain communities and the mining communities of eastern Kentucky, and they would take that disease with them. And there were no doctors. And so the death toll just rose and rose. And so Corbie Ellington missed that infection by 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Seemed like he had a guardian angel there. And so he had such other luck as he crossed the country of France. And well, in fact, as he went by train and went by ship across the ocean and then across a good portion of France, and luck seemed to always be with him. It seemed that he was charmed. Now, letters from his fellow soldiers and from his commanding officers would all reflect that Corbie was not just one of the guys. Corbie was 26 years old, and 25 and 26 there, and he would separate himself from the guys who were shooting dice and gambling and that type of thing. And he would separate himself from them many times, and they would find him sitting alone under a tree or whatever, wherever he could find respite, reading his little Bible that he kept in his pocket, or writing these little postcards to Hannah. So he was not an ordinary soldier in some ways. He was a little older than many of the soldiers as well. But he was private, just like all of the soldiers were. It seemed that he was charmed. However, on June the 12th of 1918, they had arrived at the Argonne Forest, and they were in trenches, very similar to this. And at one point, the whistle blew, and they went over these ladders, just like this one, over the top, and into battle. Machine gun fire was heavy. And you know, as a bugler, his job, he had two jobs. He had to not only carry his rifle and use that for defense when he could, and offense as well, but he also had that bugle. Now, the buglers were extremely important in World War I, because that's, if you had troops that were stretched a mile or a mile and a half long, they couldn't hear commands, obviously. So the bugles would send certain music that would, bugle calls, that would mean various things. It may mean go forward, it may mean pause, it may mean retreat, it may mean a lot of things, okay? But the messages, what would happen is you'd have a bugler in this country or company, and he would sound a message, and that would be repeated by the next bugler, 400 feet or 500 feet down the road, and or maybe 500 yards even, and then the next bugler. And so those, very quickly, these buglers would respond to those calls, and so the entire force got the command that the general commander wanted to do, or wanted the action that wanted to be taken. So Corbie goes over the ladder, and he heads out. He's charging towards the enemy when he has found himself in a position where a big Bertha bomb lands in his vicinity, and the shrapnel kills him. Part of the shrapnel went through the Bible on his chest pocket. I don't know where the other pieces of shrapnel went, but we do know that he was killed in action. And letters from his commanding officers and from his fellow soldiers. People wrote letters back in those days. So a lot of this, just his ordinary soldier friends would write letters to Hannah and tell her about him dying honorably, going forward in battle. Of course, when she got the telegram, she was devastated. And though they had no children, she would never marry again. He was buried at the Argonne Meuse Cemetery in France, a huge cemetery that still exists today, crosses upon crosses upon crosses of the men that are still buried there today. But in 1921, his body was exhumed, and he was brought back to the United States and to Lexington, Kentucky, under full military honors. He was buried in grave number 1173 in the military portion of what is now the city, Lexington City Cemetery. And his tombstone and his grave sets under the shade of a large oak tree, just like the large oak trees that he had on his farm as a boy and as a young man. It's rather fitting. And in the summertime, I've been there many times. And in the summertime, that shade tree shades his grave like the oak trees did in his childhood and in his youth, sheltering him from the sun on those hot sunny days when he needed to take a rest. It stands like a silent sentry over his grave. How fitting. So when his body was brought back to the United States, not only was it brought under full military escort, but he was given his full military honors at the Lexington Cemetery. Then in 1929, 15 of his fellow soldiers from our area unanimously chose him as a namesake for the brand new American Legion here in Moorhead. Now, the American Legion had started in France in 1919, but it had, and post number 1 is still in Paris, France, because when World War I ended, we actually thought the war was going to go through 1920, and when the Germans gave up at the end of 1918, there was no mechanism for the soldiers to get back home. And so it took sometimes up to a year for all of our soldiers to get home. And so that's where the American Legion was formed by some of our founders for the American Legion were Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. would go on to be a storied officer in World War II, fighting with his men on Omaha Beach on D-Day in World War II. But Corbie Ellington was our local hero. He wasn't our only local hero. And you know, he stands guard, or stands as a representative, I should say, for not just his World War I veterans, but for veterans that have fought in the name of freedom across the ages, from the birth of our nation to the present day. And certainly for all of his World War I soldiers. People ask me, say, what is so special about Corbie Ellington? Well, what is really special about Corbie Ellington is that he's not special at all. Oh, yes, he was very heroic. He was going forth, charging in battle when he was killed. There's no question about that. But what is special about him is that he is not special in that he was just an ordinary farm boy. A farm man, I should say, at 26 years old when he died. 26 days before the end of the war. He was 26 years old, and he died 26 days before the end of World War I. What a tragedy. It's been an honor to study about him and to learn about him and learn about his life and his sacrifices and to learn about the Ellington family as a whole. So in 2018, the government, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the County of Rowan, and the City of Moorhead, each individually proclaimed October the 12th, for not just in 2018, but for every year thereafter, in perpetuity, to be Corbie Ellington Day, not just in Round County, but across the entire Commonwealth. And so we celebrate that today. They never knew, I should say, they never wanted to go to war. They never wanted to leave their families and friends. They did so because they believed it was the right thing to do. And that is a loose quote from General Norman Schwarzkopf. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. That marks our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely sing and fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Thank you, and may God bless you. May God bless this nation. Thank you.